Today I'm going to show you how to transform this junky old piece of wood using all natural materials into a botanical treasure. If you like to play around with mixed media techniques and enjoy working with natural materials like dried flowers, I think you're going to be amazed how beeswax can fit into your artist's toolkit. I think of beeswax as a natural alternative to something like glue or Mod Podge or even varnish. In fact, there's a special additive, an all-natural tree resin that can be added to beeswax to make it even better. You end up with a product called encaustic medium. It sounds intimidating, but it's basically 90% beeswax and 10% tree resin. So you can notice a color difference as well. If you were to add the tree resin to your own beeswax, you might get a more yellow product, or you can buy purified beeswax and combine the tree resin that way. So I like to buy mine in bulk from the art supply. The tree resin will make your beeswax have a higher melting temperature, and it will be harder and more durable when it's dried. So it's a great medium, and you can combine it with pigments to get different colored paints, if you will. And then as you can see behind me, I have a pancake griddle. So for today's project, we're going to get started with a block of wood. Looks pretty boring. It was somebody's cast off from when they built their cedar fence, I think. But for me, this is the perfect panel for making a really great piece of art. The best way to work with beeswax or encaustic medium is to keep it liquefied at a temperature under 200 degrees. So a pancake griddle or a dedicated wax melter with a thermostat are your best bet to minimize any potential fumes. Now, my first step in a composition is figuring out the background. So I'll prep the wood with a layer of encaustic medium to have some stickiness, and then I'll put a layer of handmade paper. This is mulberry paper, and I just love the texture of it. It looks like ground. It looks like a hillside. So I just tore the paper. I'm going to put it on top and then put another layer of encaustic medium on the surface. Now, the encaustic medium or beeswax can build up pretty quickly. So one way to sort of thin it out is to use a heat source. And here I'm going to use a blowtorch. Now, don't get intimidated. You don't have to use a blowtorch. You can also use a heat gun or a hair dryer if you don't have a heat gun or a blowtorch. These heat sources will help dissipate the wax and get them embedded into the paper, get them embedded into the wood, and fuse each layer of wax to each other so the layers don't slide off or chip off. So it's definitely an important step working with beeswax is to use that heat source to make sure everything is bonded. So the rest of the background is going to be my sky, if you will. So I'm going to use one color in this composition, and that's going to be more of like a whitish, more like a cream color. It's a little bit translucent, but I love the effect of that. That's the beauty of encaustic medium and beeswax, is that you can sort of see through it. So I dab it on with a sponge. And I like a sponge because it holds a lot of material and you can transfer a lot of it at once. It's a matter of personal preference. You know, you can use brushes, you can use sponges, but I do love the effect that you get from dabbing with a sponge. And if you don't have a heat tool at the beginning, that's fine. You can remove excess wax by using a scraping tool. So like a plastic card or even like a metal pottery tool, something that can scrape away a little excess layer can work in your favor as well. For this piece, I've already decided that I wanted to use a couple of California poppies. I'm just trying to figure out the right placement for them. Since this is sort of a longer piece of wood and the flowers are sort of short, it's nice to be able to spread them out. So I spend a little bit of time trying to figure out the positioning of my botanicals. But I think this piece is going to need a little bit more than just the California poppies. So let me look in my stash and see what I can find. I think I like the colors of this Russian sage. So I'm going to add Russian sage somewhere on this piece. And I'm going to press it into the background because the wax is still warm. So it's going to hold my flower for a little bit until I put a layer on the top. So I'm just brushing another layer of the encaustic medium over the surface of the flowers, and it acts like a sealant. It acts like a glue. As long as I don't put it on too heavy, you can still see the flower through the wax medium. But as I'm looking at this composition, I'm still feeling like it's missing some other elements. So I'm going to look in my dried flower stash and pick out something else. So right now, I think delicate white flowers would be the perfect balance. It's going to help me cover up some of my stem origins so it doesn't look like my flowers are floating in space. And it's just going to bring a little bit more cohesion to the piece just to kind of spread out these little white bedstraw flowers that came from our yard this summer. It's too bad that they're dried because they smell very sweet and delicious when they're fresh. So that is about the extent of my composition. I think I'm really delighted with how the placements came out and the choice of flowers that I made. And here I'm actually scraping away some excess wax. The white bedstraw flowers are very delicate, so I want to make sure that they're really glued in there, but it's also kind of risky to melt away excess wax with a blowtorch at this point since those flowers can burn very easily. So instead of trying to blowtorch away excess wax, I'm going to scrape it away with a little loop tool. So it's a little metal wire loop tool. You could use a pottery tool or anything you can think of to scrape. When the wax is white like this, it's very warm still, so it's very easy to scrape. I'm just using a very light touch to scrape away excess wax. But this definitely is a part of the process because a lot of excess wax and you kind of lose your flower definition and it kind of spoils it. So I definitely take my time doing this. So there's one more step that I like to do when I'm working with dried flowers, and that is to add back a little bit of pigment on the surface of the flowers. This can help combat any potential fading that can happen when exposed to light, which inevitably happens over the course of a lifetime with dried flowers. But when you add pigment to the surface, it can kind of keep some of the color embedded into the wax. So right now I'm going to be using mica pigments in different shades to kind of match my flower. So I've got a lavender colored one for the Russian sage, and I'm going to use a marigold colored one for my California poppies, and then I'm going to use green for the stems, and then I've got white for the white flowers. So it does take a little bit of effort to kind of dab on these mica pigments onto the surface, and to ensure that those pigments stay in place, that's going to require a heat treatment. So we know that we've got a layer of the encaustic over the flowers. We have mica pigments on top of the surface. And so the next step is to fuse those in. But before I go over it with a blowtorch, because this part is very delicate, you can easily burn your flowers this way. I'm going to scrape away some of the excess wax that I see with one of my scrapey tools. So I have a wire loop, a very small one that I'm just using to scrape away some of the excess wax before I go through with my final blowtorch pass. And this definitely helps. I can get rid of a lot of the wax with a blowtorch, but that also increases my chances of burning the flower. So I'd rather scrape what I can and then just do a very quick pass over the pigments to seal them in to the surface of the flowers. And that's looking really good. And there's just a couple more finishing steps to go. And that is to trim the handmade paper away from the edges. So I use a razor blade to do that. And it's better to use a very, very sharp razor blade because it makes that part a lot easier. And then the final step is to scrape away the excess wax that has dripped over the side. Now, a lot of people that do work with encaustic, they will tape up their sides, but I find it just as time efficient to just scrape it with a razor blade at the end. I'm using rustic wood anyway, so it's not something I'm worried about scratching. And there it is, the final piece. All right, and so that's my process for creating beautiful dried flower preserved specimens using all natural materials, upcycled wood, beeswax, pigments, and of course the beautiful botanicals. So I hope to hear from you. What do you think? Is this something you would try at home to transform some of your favorite flowers into a masterpiece?